Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My hiking boots had covered nearly 14 miles that Friday in early September, and every muscle in my legs screamed for rest. The Chihuahuan Desert stretched endlessly around me, a brutal landscape of creosote bushes, ocotillo and rust-colored rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels frozen in time. Most of my college friends had settled into mortgages and minivan payments by now, but here I was, taking a solo trip through one of the most isolated stretches of wilderness in New Mexico, trying to figure out what came next after leaving my nursing job in Albuquerque. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, and I needed to find a spot to pitch my tent before darkness swallowed everything. I had been hiking off trail for most of the day, deliberately avoiding the more popular routes because I craved solitude. The foothills rose around me like crumbling staircases, dotted with boulders the size of small cars. When I spotted a cluster of sandstone formations creating a natural alcove, I felt a wave of relief wash through my exhausted body. It was perfect, sheltered from wind, invisible from any direction unless someone walked right up to it. I set up my small two-person tent behind the largest rock, positioning it so the opening faced the stone wall, rather than the open desert. Privacy felt important out here, even though I had not seen another human being since leaving the trailhead that morning. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that city people never truly experience, where you can hear your own heartbeat pulsing in your ears. I ate a cold dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, watching the stars emerge one by one until the entire sky transformed into a glittering canvas. My phone showed no signal, which I expected. I had downloaded offline maps before the trip and told my sister Valerie I would check in when I reached the next town in 3 days. By 9:30, I had crawled into my sleeping bag, bone-tired and oddly peaceful. The desert air cooled rapidly after sunset, and I zipped the tent closed, listening to the gentle rustle of wind against nylon. Sleep came quickly, pulling me under like a warm current, and for a few hours, everything was exactly as I had hoped it would be. The sound ripped me from sleep like a hand yanking me out of water. Engines, loud, aggressive, unmistakably the high-pitched whine of ATVs tearing through the desert floor. My eyes snapped open in the pitch blackness of my tent, and I lay completely still, my breath trapped somewhere in my chest. The noise grew louder, echoing off the rock formations, bouncing around until it seemed to come from every direction at once. I fumbled for my phone and checked the time, 11:47. For a long moment, I convinced myself it was just recreational riders, maybe some locals who knew the terrain and liked to race through the desert at night. But something about the way the engines revved, stopping and starting in irregular bursts, made my skin prickle with unease. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, moving inch by inch to avoid making any sound. The engines cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I crept to the mesh window of my tent and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vague shapes of rocks and scrub brush under a sliver of moon. Then I noticed the lights, not headlights but handheld flashlights, 4 or 5 of them, bobbing about 300 yards to the east where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the beams sweep back and forth across the dirt. I could make out silhouettes now, maybe 4 or 5 figures moving with purpose, their movements coordinated like they had done this before. One of them carried something long across his shoulders, a rifle or a shotgun. I could not tell which from this distance. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay hidden, to not move, to barely breathe. I pressed myself lower against the tent floor, watching through the tiny window, as the figures gathered in a loose circle around a specific spot on the ground. Then I heard the sound of metal striking earth, rhythmic and deliberate, and I realized with dawning horror that they were digging. The digging continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I did not dare move from my position, barely allowing myself to blink as I watched the flashlight beams dance across the basin. My legs cramped from holding still, but the fear running through my veins kept me anchored in place. Eventually the shoveling stopped, and I heard voices carry across the still night air. Low, masculine, too distant to make out specific words but close enough to catch the tone. They sounded casual, almost businesslike, like men discussing a routine task rather than whatever nightmare I was witnessing. Two of the figures broke away from the group and walked back toward where I assumed the ATVs were parked, disappearing behind a ridge. When they returned, they were dragging something between them, something large and heavy wrapped in what looked like a blue plastic tarp. The shape was unmistakable, even from 300 yards away. I had seen enough bodies during my years in the emergency room to recognize the proportions, the way the weight distributed, the limpness of limbs beneath synthetic material. They rolled the tarp into the pit with a carelessness that made bile rise in my throat. One of the men said something, and another laughed, a short barking sound that echoed off the rocks and reached me with sickening clarity. I watched as they began shoveling dirt back into the hole, working quickly now, their flashlights occasionally sweeping wider arcs across the terrain. Every time a beam swung in my general direction, I pressed my face into the tent floor and held my breath until spots danced behind my eyelids. My phone sat useless in my pocket, no signal bars mocking me with their absence. I thought about all the true crime podcasts I had listened to during long shifts, all the stories of people who stumbled onto something they should not have seen and paid the price. The desert was vast, empty, unforgiving. If something happened to me out here, Valerie would not even know to worry for another 3 days. By then I could be buried in my own shallow pit, just another mystery that the sand would eventually swallow. The men finished their work and gathered their tools. I watched one of them pour something from a jug over the freshly turned earth. Water maybe, or something to mask a scent from animals. They stood around for a few more minutes, smoking cigarettes whose orange tips glowed like tiny demons in the darkness. Then, one by one, they mounted their ATVs. The engines roared back to life, shattering the silence, and the headlights flicked on in a blinding burst. I buried my face in my arms as the beams swept across the desert floor, certain that at any moment they would land on my tent, and everything would be over. But the sound began to fade, moving away, heading south toward what I assumed was a road or a trail that connected to civilization. I waited until the noise dissolved completely into the night, until the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the frantic thudding of my pulse in my ears. Even then, I could not bring myself to move. I lay there in the darkness, trembling, replaying what I had seen over and over until the images burned themselves permanently into my brain. I must have stayed frozen in that position for at least an hour, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness of that tent. Eventually, the rational part of my brain began to reassert itself, pushing through the fog of terror with practical thoughts. I needed to get out of here. I needed to move, to put as many miles as possible between myself and that shallow grave before sunrise. If I left now and hiked through the night, I could reach the highway by mid-morning and flag down a car. I could call the police, report what I saw, let them handle it. Slowly, carefully, I began gathering my things, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack with hands that refused to stop shaking. I did not want to turn on my headlamp. The darkness felt like the only protection I had left, so I worked by touch alone, fingers fumbling with zippers and straps. When I finally had everything packed, I crept to the tent door and unzipped it just enough to slip outside. That was when I saw it, and the air left my lungs like I had been punched in the chest. A tire track. Fresh, deep, pressed into the soft desert sand no more than 6 inches from the edge of my tent. The tread pattern was thick and aggressive, the kind you see on off-road vehicles, and it curved around the rock formation in a deliberate arc before disappearing back toward the basin. They had come here. While I was hiding inside, paralyzed with fear, one of them had driven right up to my campsite, close enough to reach out and touch the nylon walls. close enough to hear me breathing if I had made a single sound. I stared at that track in the pale moonlight, my mind refusing to process what it meant. They knew I was here. They had seen my tent, probably spotted it when their headlights swept across the rocks, and instead of confronting me, they had simply left. Why? The question gnawed at me as I stood there, exposed and vulnerable in the open air. Were they coming back? Were they watching me right now from somewhere in the darkness, waiting to see what I would do? The desert suddenly felt alive with invisible eyes, every shadow a potential threat, every whisper of wind a footstep creeping closer. I did not have time to think. I did not have the luxury of fear. I grabbed my pack and started moving, heading north, away from the burial site, away from the tire track, away from everything. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me across the uneven terrain while my eyes strained against the darkness. I could not use my headlamp. If they were watching, the light would make me an easy target. So I navigated by starlight alone, tripping over rocks and scrub brush, catching myself on my palms again and again. The skin on my hands tore open, but I barely felt it. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, straining for the sound of engines or footsteps, but the desert remained silent. After what felt like hours, the eastern horizon began to lighten, shifting from black to deep purple to the first pale hints of orange. I had covered maybe 5 or 6 miles, pushing myself harder than I ever had in my life, and when I finally crested a ridge and saw a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the valley below, I nearly collapsed with relief. The highway, civilization, safety, or at least the illusion of it. A trucker named Wallace picked me up around 7 in the morning. He was an older man with a gray beard and kind eyes, hauling agricultural equipment down to Las Cruces, and he did not ask too many questions when I stumbled out of the scrubland looking like I had crawled through hell. He let me use his phone to call 911, and I sat in the cab of his rig shaking so hard that I could barely hold the device steady while I described what I had witnessed. The dispatcher transferred me to the county sheriff's department, and a deputy met us at a gas station about 30 miles down the road. I told him everything: the ATVs, the flashlights, the men with the tarp, the shallow pit, the tire track inches from my tent. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when I finished, he asked me if I could lead them back to the location. The thought of returning to that place made me want to vomit, but I nodded anyway. Whatever was buried in that desert, whoever it was, they deserved to be found. They deserved justice, or at the very least, a proper grave. It took most of that day to organize a search team and navigate back to the basin where I had watched the men dig. I rode in a sheriff's SUV with 2 deputies, following coordinates I had marked on my offline map, and the entire drive felt like descending back into a nightmare. When we arrived, the afternoon sun was blazing overhead, turning the desert into a furnace of heat and light. The deputies fanned out with shovels and a cadaver dog, and within 20 minutes, the dog alerted on a patch of disturbed earth exactly where I said it would be. They dug carefully, methodically, and when the first corner of blue tarp emerged from the sand, one of the deputies looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of validation and horror, like he had hoped I was wrong but knew I was not. They found a body. A woman, the medical examiner later determined, probably in her early 40s, dead less than 48 hours. The case remains open to this day. They never caught the men responsible, never identified the victim, never explained why they left me alive when they clearly knew I was there. I have thought about that question every single day for the past 2 years. Sometimes I convince myself they did not see me at all, that the tire track was just a coincidence, a random pass during their sweep of the area. Other times, in the darker hours of the night when sleep refuses to come, I believe they made a deliberate choice. That killing a witness would have complicated things, drawn more attention, created another body to bury. Maybe I was more useful to them alive, a traumatized hiker whose story would sound too wild to believe, who had no real evidence beyond her own terrified eyes. I moved back east after that trip, took a nursing job in Pennsylvania, where the landscape is green and the horizons are short. I do not hike alone anymore. I do not camp in places where I cannot see who is coming from every direction. The desert took something from me that night, some fundamental sense of safety that I will never get back. But it also gave me something, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive, smart enough to stay silent when silence was all that stood between me and a shallow grave. Whoever that woman was, I hope she has found peace. I hope someone, somewhere, is still looking for her. And I hope that the men who buried her in that basin are looking over their shoulders every single day, wondering if the witness they left alive will be the reason their world comes crashing down. After my divorce got finalized in April 2015, I made a decision that most people in my life thought was either brave or completely stupid. I quit my accounting job at a firm in Baltimore where I had spent 9 miserable years, sold most of my furniture, and decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail alone. My therapist called it running away from your problems with extra steps, which made me laugh for the first time in months. At 34, with no kids, no mortgage anymore, and a decent chunk of savings, I figured if there was ever a time to disappear into the woods for a few weeks, this was it. I had done some camping before, nothing too extreme, mostly weekend trips with college buddies back when we were young, and thought sleeping on rocks was fun. But solo backpacking through remote Appalachia was different. I knew that going in, or at least I thought I did. I had been on the trail for about 6 days when I reached a ridge that my map labeled as Creighton's Bluff, somewhere in the backcountry of Western Virginia. The spot was perfect for camping, a flat clearing about 30 feet from a steep drop-off that overlooked a valley thick with old-growth forest. No other hikers had passed me in almost 2 days, which was exactly what I wanted. Cell service had died sometime around day 3, and I had made peace with being completely disconnected. That Wednesday evening, I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked some dehydrated chili that tasted like cardboard mixed with regret. The sun dropped behind the mountains around 8, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that made me feel for a moment like maybe this whole trip was not such a crazy idea after all. I remember sitting there, watching the valley below fade into shadow, feeling genuinely calm for the first time since my ex-wife told me she had been seeing someone else. That calm would not last through the night. It started around 10:30, maybe 11. I was lying in my tent, not quite asleep, but drifting in that hazy space between awake and dreaming, when I heard the first rock, a sharp crack echoing up from the valley below, the unmistakable sound of stone hitting stone. I did not think much of it at first. Rocks fall, animals knock things loose, the mountains are alive with small noises at night. But then I heard another one, and another, and they were not random. There was a rhythm to them, a deliberate pattern, like someone was throwing rocks off a ledge at steady intervals. One every 8 or 10 seconds, each impact ringing through the darkness like a slow, patient drumbeat. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the cold night air, my breath misting in front of my face. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see my own boots. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared down into the valley. But there was nothing to see, just blackness, thick and absolute, swallowing everything below the ridgeline. The rocks kept falling. I counted them. 14, 15, 16, each one landing somewhere far below with that same sharp crack. It sounded like they were being thrown from somewhere to my left, maybe a quarter mile along the ridge, but I could not see any light or movement in that direction. No flashlight beam, no campfire glow, nothing to suggest another hiker was out there in the dark. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a bear knocking stones loose while foraging, or a rock slide that just happened to have a weirdly consistent pace. But I had spent enough time in the woods to know what natural sounds felt like, and this did not feel natural. This felt intentional, purposeful, like someone was sending a message across the darkness, and I just could not understand what it meant. After about 20 minutes, the rocks stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I climbed back into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay there with my eyes wide open, listening to my own heartbeat pound against the ground beneath me. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember is snapping awake to complete silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the forest itself is holding its breath. My watch said it was 1:47 in the morning. I lay still for a long moment, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I saw it, a faint glow moving through the trees in the valley below. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that maybe I was still half asleep and imagining things. But the light was real. It was dim and yellowish like an old lantern or a candle behind dirty glass, and it was weaving between the trees maybe half a mile down the slope. I grabbed my binoculars from my pack and pressed them to my face, trying to get a better look. The light bobbed and swayed as it moved, disappearing behind tree trunks and reappearing a few seconds later, heading in a direction that made no sense. There was no trail down there. I had studied my map carefully before setting up camp, and that part of the valley was unmarked wilderness, nothing but dense forest and rough terrain for miles. Then I saw another light. This one appeared further to the right, maybe 200 yards from the first, moving in a parallel path through the darkness. And then a third, even further out, barely visible through the canopy. 3 lights, all moving at roughly the same pace, all heading in the same general direction, like some kind of silent procession through the woods. I watched them for almost 15 minutes. My binoculars pressed so hard against my face that they left marks on my skin. The lights never flickered like flashlights would. They never swept back and forth like someone searching for a trail. They just drifted steadily forward, smooth and purposeful, weaving between obstacles I could not see. I tried to convince myself it was other hikers, maybe a group doing some kind of night trek, but nothing about the way those lights moved suggested normal hiking. Normal hikers stumble. Normal hikers stop to check their footing. These lights glided through the forest like they knew exactly where they were going, like they had walked that path 1,000 times before in the dark. Around 2:15, the lights changed direction, all 3 of them, almost simultaneously, like they had received some signal I could not hear. They stopped their forward movement and began angling upward toward the ridge, toward me. I lowered the binoculars and felt my chest tighten. It could have been a coincidence. The ridge was a natural landmark, and if those people were heading somewhere specific, following the high ground would make sense. But the timing felt wrong. They had been moving parallel to the ridge for 15 minutes, and now suddenly, they were climbing. I sat there in the darkness watching those 3 dim lights slowly ascend the slope, and I tried to calculate how long it would take them to reach the top. An hour maybe. Maybe less if they knew the terrain well. I thought about packing up and leaving, but hiking alone at night on a trail I barely knew seemed like a good way to twist an ankle or walk off a cliff. So I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that those lights were probably just locals out hunting or checking traps or doing whatever people did in these mountains after dark. I told myself a lot of things that night. None of them made me feel any better. By 3 in the morning, the lights had disappeared. I had lost sight of them about 40 minutes earlier, when they dropped below the tree line on their way up the slope. I kept expecting to see them emerge from the forest at the edge of my clearing, to hear voices or footsteps approaching through the brush. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. I sat with my back against a tree, facing the direction the lights had been coming from, my headlamp off and my knife in my hand. It was a folding blade, nothing impressive, but holding it made me feel slightly less helpless. The fire had gone completely cold by then, just a circle of gray ash that offered no warmth and no light. I thought about relighting it, but something told me not to. Something told me that right now, in this moment, being visible was not a good idea. So I sat in the dark and I waited, my ears straining for any sound that did not belong. The mountains around me felt different than they had during the day, older somehow, hostile, like I had wandered into a place where I was not supposed to be, and something out there knew it. I do not know when I fell asleep. I did not mean to. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stay alert, but exhaustion must have won eventually. One moment I was staring into the darkness with my knife clutched against my chest, and the next I was blinking awake to pale gray light filtering through the trees. Dawn. I had made it to dawn. My neck ached from sleeping upright against the tree, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the knife handle for hours. I sat there for a moment, letting the relief wash over me, listening to the first birds beginning to call in the canopy above. In the daylight, everything seemed almost normal again. The valley below was just a valley, green and quiet and unthreatening. The ridge was just a ridge. I let out a long breath and started to push myself up from the ground, already thinking about packing up my gear and putting as many miles as possible between me and this place. That is when I noticed the footprints. They were about 8 feet from where I had been sitting, pressed into the soft dirt near the remains of my campfire. I walked over slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The prints were bare feet. No boots, no shoes, just the clear impression of naked soles and toes pressed into the earth. They were wide, wider than my own feet by a good margin, and the toes were splayed apart in a way that looked almost unnatural, like whoever made them was used to walking without footwear. I crouched down and studied them, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were at least a dozen prints, overlapping in places, circling the dead fire in a slow, deliberate pattern. Whoever had made them had walked around my campsite while I slept. They had stood right there, right next to the ashes, close enough to touch my tent if they had reached out. I followed the tracks with my eyes, tracing their path around the fire pit, and felt something cold settle into my stomach when I saw where they led. The prints came right up to the base of the tree I had been leaning against. They stopped maybe 6 inches from where my legs had been stretched out in the dirt. Someone had stood over me in the darkness, barefoot and silent, watching me sleep, and I had not heard a thing. I packed my gear in under 5 minutes. I did not bother with breakfast, did not bother folding my tent properly, did not bother with any of the careful routines I had developed over the past week on the trail. I just shoved everything into my pack with shaking hands and started moving. The footprints led away from my campsite toward the eastern edge of the ridge, disappearing into a dense thicket of rhododendron that I had no intention of following. I went the opposite direction, back toward the main trail, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full run. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, scanning the trees around me for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet except for the birds and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. Too quiet, maybe. I kept thinking about those wide, splayed toes pressed into the earth, about how close they had been to my body while I slept. I kept thinking about the lights in the valley, moving in perfect coordination through the darkness. And I kept thinking about the rocks, that steady rhythm echoing across the mountains like a signal. A signal to whom? A signal for what? I did not want to know the answer. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked for nearly 7 hours straight, barely stopping except to drink water and check my map. By late afternoon, I had reached a small town called Bradshaw's Crossing. Nothing more than a gas station, a general store, and a cluster of old houses scattered along a 2-lane road. I must have looked like a wreck when I walked into that store. Dirty, exhausted, wild-eyed, because the old woman behind the counter took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told her I had been camping up on Creighton's Bluff and had a rough night. She got quiet for a moment, her face doing something complicated that I could not quite read. Then she said, real casual, that most folks around here knew better than to camp up on that ridge. Said there were people who lived back in those hollows, families that had been there for generations, who did not take kindly to outsiders on what they considered their land. She did not say anything else, did not elaborate, just handed me my change and wished me safe travels with a look in her eyes that told me I was lucky to be standing there at all. I drove home the next day, sold my camping gear a week later. I have not been back to Appalachia since, and I do not plan to ever go again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythm in my head. Rock after rock after rock, falling into the darkness like a countdown to something I was never meant to see. My college roommate, Brianna, had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a celebration. All 5 of us had just survived our junior year finals, and we were desperate to decompress before summer internships scattered us across different states. The group was me, Brianna, our friend Chloe from the photography club, and 2 guys from our study group, Austin and Wesley. Brianna and I had shared a dorm since freshman year, which means I was 21 that spring. Still young enough to believe that bad things only happened to people who made bad decisions. I had known Austin since orientation week, and he had always been a little intense, but in a way that seemed harmless back then. He was the kind of guy who would text you 17 times if you did not respond within an hour, who remembered every detail of every conversation you ever had with him. Brianna used to joke that he would make someone a very attentive boyfriend someday. None of us were laughing by the end of that weekend. We drove up to Blackwood Ridge in Austin's pickup truck on a Friday afternoon. The campsite was about 4 hours from campus, deep in a national forest that Brianna had discovered through some hiking forum online. She had printed out maps, packed enough supplies for a week even though we were only staying 2 nights, and created a whole itinerary of trails and lookout points she wanted us to visit. The drive up was normal enough. We played music, passed around bags of chips and gummy worms, talked about professors we hated and classes we were dreading in the fall. Austin was quieter than usual, spending most of the ride staring out the window at the passing trees. I figured he was just exhausted from finals like the rest of us. When we finally pulled off the main road onto the dirt path leading to our campsite, the sun was already starting to dip below the tree line. The forest closed around us like a fist, branches scraping against the windows as if trying to get in. I remember thinking how isolated we were, how far from everything. At the time, it felt like freedom. We set up camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we parked. Wesley and Brianna handled the tents while Chloe gathered kindling for the fire pit. Austin immediately started giving directions, even though nobody had asked him to be in charge. He told Wesley the tent stakes were going in at the wrong angle. He told Brianna the rain fly was inside out. He walked over to where Chloe was collecting sticks and started sorting through her pile, tossing aside the ones he deemed too damp or too thin. I watched him from across the clearing, and something about the way he moved struck me as odd. There was a nervous energy to him, a tightness in his shoulders that had not been there during the drive. When I asked if he was okay, he turned to me with this strange look, not angry, not sad, just empty somehow, and said he was fine. Then he smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Brianna caught my gaze and shrugged, mouthing the word finals, as if that explained everything. I wanted to believe her. That first night around the campfire should have been perfect. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than I had ever seen living in the city, and Chloe had brought her portable speaker so we could listen to music while we roasted marshmallows. But Austin kept steering the conversation in uncomfortable directions. He brought up a party from sophomore year where Brianna had gotten too drunk and needed someone to walk her home. He had been that someone, and he made sure we all remembered it. He mentioned the time he had helped Chloe edit her photography portfolio at 2 a.m. before a submission deadline. He talked about lending Wesley money for textbooks, about driving me to the pharmacy when I had the flu last winter. Every story was technically true, but the way he told them made it sound like we all owed him something. Wesley tried to change the subject a few times, but Austin kept circling back. By the time we crawled into our tents around midnight, the mood had shifted. The easy laughter from the car ride felt like it belonged to a different trip entirely. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of arguing. The sun was barely up, pale light filtering through the tent fabric, and I could hear Austin's voice outside, low and insistent. I unzipped the flap just enough to see him standing with Chloe near the edge of the clearing. She had her arms crossed tight against her chest, and even from 20 feet away I could tell she was upset. Austin was leaning toward her, one hand gesturing toward the woods, the other gripping her elbow. When Chloe tried to pull away, he held on for just a second too long before letting go. She walked back toward the tents without looking at him, her face pale. I pretended to be asleep when she climbed back into the tent she shared with Brianna. Later, when I asked what happened, Chloe said Austin had wanted her to go on an early morning hike with him, just the two of them. When she said no, he had gotten weird about it. She used that exact word, weird. Not angry, not aggressive, just weird. Like he could not understand why she would possibly refuse. Like the concept of someone saying no to him did not compute. Brianna suggested we all stick together for the rest of the trip, and we agreed. But Austin acted like nothing had happened. The rest of the morning, Austin kept finding reasons to separate us. He asked Wesley to help him gather firewood on the opposite side of the camp, then spent 40 minutes walking him deeper and deeper into the trees until Wesley finally insisted they head back. He told Brianna there was an amazing view just 10 minutes down a trail, and when she said she would rather wait for the group, he sulked for an hour. He kept appearing beside me whenever I wandered even a few feet from the others, materializing silently like he had been watching and waiting for the moment I was alone. Each time he would say something casual. "Nice morning. Did you sleep okay? Want to check out that stream I found?" But his eyes tracked my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle. By noon, we had all noticed the pattern. Wesley pulled me aside while Austin was in his tent and whispered that something was seriously wrong. He said Austin had been talking during their firewood walk about how none of us appreciated him, how he did everything for this group and got nothing in return. Wesley's hands were trembling when he told me. He wanted to leave. We all did. But Austin had the only car, and he had the keys in his pocket. We tried to act normal for the rest of the afternoon, but the tension was suffocating. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. Austin would join in, say something that seemed friendly enough on the surface, and then add a little comment that landed like a slap. When Brianna mentioned she was excited about her summer internship in Boston, Austin said it was funny how she always managed to land on her feet, unlike some people who actually had to work for things. When Chloe took photos of the creek, Austin asked if she ever got tired of hiding behind a camera instead of actually connecting with people. Each remark was delivered with a smile, in a tone that made you question whether you had heard it right. Brianna kept shooting me glances that screamed we need to talk, but there was never a moment when Austin was not hovering nearby. Around 4 in the afternoon, Chloe announced she was going to take a nap in her tent. Brianna said she would join her. Wesley suddenly remembered he had a headache and retreated to the tent he shared with Austin. I started to follow Brianna, desperate to regroup and figure out a plan, but Austin stepped directly into my path. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I said I was tired too, that we could talk later, but he shook his head slowly. He said this could not wait. He said he had found something in the woods earlier that morning, something bad. A hiker, he said, about a mile down the eastern trail. She had fallen and hurt her leg, could not walk, and was alone out there with no cell service and no way to get help. He said he had been waiting all day to tell someone, but did not want to scare the group. He said the woman was in real pain and we needed to help her right now. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and he reached out to take my hand. He said the others would slow us down, that we needed to move fast, just the two of us. Something about the way he said it, just the two of us, made my heart start pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told him we should get Wesley. Austin's face flickered. Just for a fraction of a second, something dark passed behind his eyes before the mask slipped back into place. He said Wesley would only slow us down, that the woman needed help now and we were wasting precious time. I told him we should at least tell Brianna where we were going in case something happened. Austin's grip on my hand tightened, and he said there was no time, that every second we stood here arguing was a second that poor woman was suffering alone in the woods. His voice cracked on the word suffering, like he was genuinely upset, and for a moment I almost believed him. Almost. But then I remembered something. That morning, when I had woken up to Austin and Chloe arguing, the sun had barely risen. Austin claimed he found this injured hiker during an early morning walk, but he had been with Chloe at dawn, trying to convince her to go hiking with him. He had not gone anywhere alone. There was no injured hiker. There never had been. The realization hit me like ice water, and I yanked my hand away from his so hard I stumbled backward. I said I needed to use the bathroom first. I said I would be right back, just give me 2 minutes and then we could go. Austin stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wanted to spit out. I kept my face blank, kept my voice steady, even though every nerve in my body was on fire. Finally, he nodded. He said he would wait right here, that I should hurry. I walked toward the tree line as calmly as I could manage, feeling his eyes burning into my back with every step. The moment I was out of his direct line of sight, I ran. I ran straight to Brianna's tent and threw open the flap, not caring about being quiet anymore. Brianna and Chloe both sat up, startled, and I told them everything in a frantic whisper. The injured hiker that did not exist. The way Austin had been trying to get me alone. The lie that unraveled the second I thought about the timeline. Chloe's face went white. Brianna grabbed my arm and pulled me inside the tent, zipping it shut behind me. Through the thin fabric walls, we could hear Austin calling my name. His voice was still calm, still friendly. That was somehow the worst part. Wesley heard the commotion and crawled out of his tent, asking what was going on. Austin intercepted him before he could reach us, and through the tent fabric I could hear Austin explaining that I had gotten upset over nothing, that I was being dramatic, that he was just trying to help someone in need and I had freaked out for no reason. His voice was so reasonable, so measured, that for a split second I wondered if I had made a mistake. But then Brianna squeezed my hand and whispered that we needed to get those keys. Chloe had her phone out, desperately searching for a signal, even though we all knew there was none this deep in the forest. We heard Wesley's voice rise. He was arguing with Austin, demanding to know what was really going on. Then there was a scuffle, the sound of someone hitting the ground, and Wesley shouted for us to run. Brianna unzipped the back of the tent, the side facing away from the campsite, and the three of us crawled out into the underbrush. We ran toward the trail that led back to the parking area, branches whipping our faces and arms, not daring to look back. I could hear Austin crashing through the woods behind us, calling our names in that same calm voice, telling us we were overreacting, telling us to stop and just talk to him. We made it to the dirt road where the truck was parked, but without the keys we could not drive. Brianna remembered passing a ranger station about 2 miles back on the main road, and we started running again. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they might give out. But I did not stop. None of us did. We reached the ranger station just as the sun was starting to set, and the woman behind the desk took one look at our faces and immediately picked up her radio. 2 rangers drove us back to the campsite in their vehicle. When we got there, Austin was sitting calmly by the fire pit, roasting a marshmallow like nothing had happened. Wesley was in his tent with a bloody nose and a bruise forming under his left eye. Austin tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that we had panicked over a joke, but the rangers were not buying it. They escorted us to our cars. One ranger drove Austin's truck with Austin in the passenger seat, while the other followed with the rest of us. We filed a report at the local police station that night. Austin was not arrested, but there was a record now, a paper trail. We never spoke to him again after that weekend. I heard through mutual friends that he transferred schools the following semester. Sometimes I still think about that moment in the clearing, when he took my hand and asked me to follow him into the woods. I think about what might have happened if I had not remembered that he was with Chloe that morning. If I had believed him, if I had gone. Camping alone seemed like a good idea when I planned it back in January. My sister had just gotten married. Most of my college buddies were having their second or third kids, And here I was, same apartment since graduation in 2012, same job at the warehouse, same routine that felt more like a slow death than a life. I needed something that would remind me I was still breathing, still capable of doing things on my own terms. So I picked a spot in the Ozarks, about 4 hours from my place in Kansas City. Deep enough into the woods that cell service became a distant memory. The campsite was technically off the grid. No designated spots, no rangers checking in, just me and whatever wildlife decided to tolerate my presence. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October, the kind of day where the leaves were turning burnt orange and the air had that crisp bite that makes you feel genuinely alive. I set up my tent about 30 yards from an old logging road that looked like it had not seen regular traffic in years, maybe decades. Overgrown with weeds, rutted with erosion, it seemed like the perfect backdrop for the solitude I was craving. That first day went exactly how I had imagined it would. I spent the afternoon hiking a trail I found on an old forestry map. Nothing too strenuous, just enough to work up a sweat and clear my head. The forest was dense with oak and hickory, and every now and then I would catch a glimpse of deer watching me from between the trees before bounding off into the underbrush. I cooked dinner over a small fire as the sun went down. Just canned chili and some bread I had packed. Nothing fancy, but it tasted incredible out there in the middle of nowhere. By 9 that evening, I was in my tent with a paperback I had been meaning to read for months, a flashlight propped against my backpack, and the sounds of the forest settling in around me. Owls hooting somewhere in the distance, branches creaking in the wind, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the fallen leaves. I fell asleep around 10, feeling more at peace than I had in months, completely unaware that in a few hours, that peace would shatter into something I still have nightmares about. The sound that woke me was not loud, but it was wrong. Out here, you get used to the natural rhythm of the forest pretty quick. Animals moving through brush, wind pushing through branches, the occasional crack of a dead limb falling somewhere in the darkness. But this was different. This was mechanical. A low rumble that grew steadily louder, the unmistakable groan of engines working hard against rough terrain. I lay there in my sleeping bag, eyes open, heart starting to pick up speed, telling myself it was probably just some hunters using the old logging road as a shortcut. People did that sometimes, right? Used abandoned roads to get deeper into hunting grounds. But something in my gut was telling me to stay quiet, stay still. Do not move until you know what you are dealing with. I checked my phone out of habit. 3:14 in the morning, no signal, battery at 62%. The engine noise grew louder and then multiplied. Not one vehicle, 2. I heard them stop maybe 50 yards from my position, engines idling for a moment before cutting off completely. Doors opened and closed, not slammed but pushed shut carefully, deliberately, the way someone closes a door when they do not want to make noise. I could hear voices now, low and indistinct, the kind of murmuring that happens when people are trying not to be heard. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay exactly where I was, but I needed to see what was happening. I unzipped my sleeping bag as slowly as humanly possible, each tooth of the zipper sounding like a gunshot in the silence of my tent. I crawled toward the mesh window on the side facing the road, keeping my body as flat as I could against the ground. The moon was about 3/4 full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, and when I pressed my face against the mesh, I could see them, 2 pickup trucks, both dark-colored, parked nose to nose on the logging road. And around them, moving with purpose, at least 5 men. They were unloading something from the bed of the first truck, rectangular bundles wrapped tight in what looked like black plastic or maybe heavy-duty trash bags, each one about the size of a large duffel bag. The men worked in near silence, passing the bundles from one to another in a chain, stacking them on the ground between the 2 vehicles. I counted the packages as they moved them, 8, 9, 10, 12 total. One of the men said something I could not make out, and another one responded with a harsh whisper that carried just enough for me to catch the tone. Angry, impatient. These were not hunters, these were not hikers who got lost. I had stumbled into something I was never supposed to see, and the realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I pressed myself even flatter against the floor of my tent, trying to make myself as small as possible, barely breathing. The arguing got louder. I could make out fragments now, something about a count being wrong, about someone named Ray who had screwed something up. One of the men, taller than the others with broad shoulders and a baseball cap, stepped away from the group and pulled out a flashlight. He clicked it on and swept the beam across the tree line, slow and deliberate, like he was looking for something specific. The light passed within 10 feet of my tent, and I swear my heart stopped beating for a full second. Then the beam swung back toward the road, and the tall man froze. He was staring at the ground near the edge of the logging road, right where the overgrown grass met the dirt. I knew instantly what he was looking at. My boot prints. The ones I had left that afternoon when I crossed the road during my hike. The ones I had not even thought twice about because who would ever see them out here in the middle of nowhere? The tall man called out to the others, his voice low but urgent. I watched as 3 of them gathered around him, flashlights clicking on one by one. All of them aimed at the ground where my tracks disappeared into the tree line, toward me. One of them pulled something from his waistband, a handgun, black and angular in the moonlight, and held it down by his side. Another one had what looked like a shotgun, the barrel catching the light as he shifted it from one hand to the other. They talked among themselves for maybe 30 seconds, their voices too quiet for me to make out the words. But their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were going to search, they were going to find me. I had maybe 2 minutes, maybe less, before one of those flashlight beams landed on my green 2-person tent, and everything I had ever worried about in my life became completely irrelevant. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it fast. Running was not an option. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and fallen branches, and I would sound like a stampeding elephant the moment I tried to move. Staying in the tent was suicide. They would find it. They would find me inside it, and whatever happened after that would not end with them politely asking me to forget what I saw. My eyes landed on a fallen oak about 15 feet from my tent, a massive trunk that had come down sometime in the last year, its root system torn up and creating a dark, hollow space beneath where it had lifted the earth. I had noticed it when I was setting up camp, thought about how it would make decent shelter if my tent failed. Now it might be the only thing that kept me alive. I grabbed my phone and my knife, the only things within reach that mattered, and I started crawling toward the back of my tent, toward the zipper that faced away from the road. Every inch felt like a mile. Every rustle of my clothing against the tent floor sounded like a scream. I got the back zipper open just enough to squeeze through, and I slithered out onto the cold ground like some kind of desperate animal. The fallen oak was right there, a dark mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest. I could hear the men entering the tree line now, maybe 40 feet behind me, their footsteps crunching through the leaves with no attempt at stealth. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. They knew someone was out here and they were coming to find them. I crawled on my belly toward the root hollow, feeling rocks and twigs dig into my chest and stomach, biting down on my lips so hard I tasted copper. The hollow was smaller than I remembered, barely big enough for a grown man to fit inside, but I wedged myself into it anyway. I pulled dead leaves over my legs, pressed my face into the dirt, and I waited. The smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. Somewhere above me an owl took flight, its wings cutting through the air with a sound like shuffled paper. The flashlight beams found my tent about 30 seconds later. I heard one of them curse, a sharp, surprised sound that cut through the quiet, and then they were all talking at once, their voices overlapping in urgent bursts. Someone said, "Check inside," and I heard the unmistakable sound of my tent being ripped open, the fabric tearing like it was made of tissue paper. They were maybe 20 feet from where I lay hidden, close enough that I could hear them breathing, close enough that if one of them decided to sweep that flashlight beam just a little to the left, just a little lower, they would see me. I pressed myself deeper into the hollow, feeling the roots dig into my back, feeling something crawl across my hand that I refused to think about. One of the men was going through my belongings now, I could hear him tossing things aside, my backpack hitting the ground, my sleeping bag being shaken out. Then a voice, clearer than the others, said something that made me dig my fingernails into the dirt. Whoever was here left in a hurry. They could still be close, spread out. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my entire life. I lay there in that hollow, not moving, barely breathing, while flashlight beams swept through the trees around me. At one point, a pair of boots stopped less than 5 feet from my hiding spot. I could see them through a gap in the roots, brown work boots caked with mud, standing right there on the other side of the fallen trunk. The man was breathing hard, annoyed, muttering something under his breath about wasting time. I watched those boots pivot slowly, the flashlight beam passing directly over the trunk above my head, and I made a deal with whatever God might be listening. If I survived this night, I would never take another moment of my ordinary, boring life for granted. The boots turned and walked away, crunching through the leaves toward the road, and I finally let myself take a full breath. But I did not move. I did not make a sound. I stayed exactly where I was, buried in the dirt like a corpse, waiting. Eventually, I heard them gathering back by the trucks. The tall man was giving orders, his voice carrying through the still night air. They were going to finish what they came here to do and get out. If whoever was camping here had run off into the woods, they were probably miles away by now, not worth chasing in the dark. I heard the bundles being loaded into the second truck, heard doors slamming shut with less care than before, heard engines starting up and tires grinding against the rutted road. The sound of those trucks fading into the distance was the sweetest thing I had ever heard, but still I did not move. I lay in that hollow for another hour, maybe 2, until the first gray light of dawn started filtering through the trees. Only then did I crawl out, covered in dirt and dead leaves and something sticky I did not want to identify. My tent was destroyed. My backpack had been dumped out and scattered, but I was alive. I was alive and they were gone, and none of it felt real. I gathered what I could salvage and hiked out of those woods faster than I have ever moved in my life. It took me almost 3 hours to reach my car, parked at a trailhead off the main highway, and another 40 minutes of driving before my phone finally picked up a signal. I pulled over at the first gas station I saw and called the police. The deputy who took my statement was a woman named Torres, mid-50s with tired eyes and a voice that suggested she had heard a lot of strange stories over the years. She listened without interrupting, wrote everything down and told me she would pass it along to the county sheriff and the DEA field office. She also told me, in that careful way cops have when they are trying not to scare you, that I should probably stay with family for a while, just in case. I did not ask her to explain what she meant by that. I did not need her to. I drove straight to my sister's place in Springfield and did not go back to my apartment for 2 weeks. I never heard anything official about what happened that night. No arrests made the news, no drug busts in the Ozarks that matched what I saw. Torres called me once, about a month later, to tell me the investigation was ongoing but that I should not expect any updates. She thanked me for coming forward and reminded me again to be careful. That was it. Sometimes I wonder if those men ever figured out who I was, if they went back to that campsite and found something I left behind, some piece of identification I did not think to grab in my panic. Sometimes I lie awake at night and imagine a dark pickup truck parked outside my building, engine idling, waiting. But it has been almost 2 years now, and nothing has happened. I still go camping, not alone anymore and never anywhere remote. I stick to established campgrounds with rangers and other families and cell service. I traded solitude for safety, and I have made my peace with that. But every now and then, when I am lying in my tent and I hear an engine in the distance, my whole body goes rigid, and I am right back in that hollow, pressing my face into the dirt, praying those boots do not come any closer. Most of my coworkers thought solo backpacking was reckless for a woman, and they never missed a chance to remind me. But by the spring of 2014, I had stopped caring what anyone thought. My marriage had crumbled 6 months earlier, My friends from nursing school were all wrapped up in toddlers and PTA meetings, and somewhere around my 34th birthday, I realized that the loneliness I felt in crowded rooms was worse than any solitude the wilderness could offer. Oregon became my refuge, the Cascade Range specifically, where the Douglas firs grow so thick they block out the sky, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I had planned this particular trip for weeks, a 4-day solo trek into a section of backcountry that most day hikers never reached. My younger sister Megan called me the night before I left, her voice tight with worry, listing every news story she could find about women who vanished on trails. I promised her I would check in at every trailhead, that I had my satellite beacon, that I knew what I was doing. She did not sound convinced. The first 2 days unfolded like a meditation. I covered about 14 miles each day, my boots finding rhythm on the packed earth, stopping only to filter water from streams so clear you could count every pebble on the bottom. The burn in my calves and shoulders felt earned, purposeful, nothing like the hollow exhaustion of crying myself to sleep in an empty apartment. By the third evening, I had pushed deep into the backcountry, reaching a small clearing roughly 7 miles from the nearest marked trailhead. I found the spot through a backpacking form, one of those hidden gems that experienced hikers whisper about, but never post coordinates for. It was perfect. Level ground for my tent, a creek babbling maybe 30 feet away, surrounded by forest so dense it felt like a fortress. I made camp while the light was still golden, hung my food bag from a high branch, and crawled into my sleeping bag with that particular peace that only comes from physical exhaustion and total isolation. I remember zipping the tent closed and thinking, finally, I can breathe. I woke to darkness and the sound of the zipper. Not a fast sound, not the careless tug of wind against fabric. This was slow, deliberate, a centimeter at a time, the metal teeth separating with a soft purr that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. My eyes snapped open and I lay there, every muscle locked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. The zipper stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, the rustle of clothing. Nothing. Just the creak in the distance and the blood pounding in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon investigating the tent, maybe the fabric had settled in the cooling night air. But I had camped dozens of times, and I knew what wind sounded like against nylon. This was not wind. This was someone testing how quietly the zipper could be opened, someone checking whether I would wake. I do not know how long I lay there. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. Time becomes strange when your body floods with adrenaline, and your brain is screaming at you to move, but your limbs refuse to cooperate. I thought about the pepper spray in the side pocket of my pack, about the small knife I kept clipped to my belt, about the satellite beacon that was supposed to be my lifeline. All of it was useless if I could not make myself move. When the zipper sound did not return, I forced myself to sit up, my sleeping bag rustling so loudly it made me wince. I grabbed my headlamp from the mesh pocket near my head and held it like a weapon, my thumb hovering over the power button. I counted to 10, then to 20, giving whoever, whatever, was outside time to leave. Then I took the deepest breath of my life, unzipped the tent flap in one fast motion, and burst out into the night with the headlamp blazing. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness and found only trees, their trunks pale and ghostly in the white light. I spun in a circle, my heart slamming against my ribs, searching for movement, for the shape of a person, for anything that would confirm I was not losing my mind. The clearing was empty. The forest stood silent and indifferent around me, the creek still murmuring its endless song somewhere to my left. I stood there in my thermal underwear and wool socks, the cold mountain air biting at my exposed skin, and I almost laughed. Almost convinced myself that I had dreamed the whole thing, that the stress of the past months had finally cracked something loose in my brain. Then I turned back toward my tent and saw my hiking poles. I had planted them in the ground beside the tent vestibule before bed, crossed in an X the way I always did, so I could find them easily in the morning. Now they were lying flat on the ground, parallel to each other, positioned almost neatly about 3 feet from where I had left them. The air left my lungs like I had been punched. I swept the headlamp beam across my campsite, forcing myself to really look at everything. My backpack was leaning against a tree where I had left it, but the main compartment buckles were undone. I always fastened them. It was habit, muscle memory from years of keeping my gear secure. I walked toward it on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. And when I got close, I could see that the top flap had been lifted, the contents slightly rearranged. My first aid kit was on top now, though I distinctly remembered packing it beneath my rain jacket. Someone had been going through my things while I slept, and they had been quiet enough that I only woke when they started on the tent. The thought made my throat close up. How long had they been there? How close had they gotten before I heard the zipper? I backed away from the pack, my headlamp swinging wildly as I scanned the tree line, suddenly certain that whoever had done this was still watching me from somewhere in that wall of darkness. I do not know what made me look down. Maybe instinct, maybe some part of my brain that understood what I needed to see before the rest of me caught up. But I angled my headlamp toward the ground around my tent, and that is when I saw the boot prints. They were clear in the soft earth, pressed deep by someone heavier than me, the treads thick and wide. A man's hiking boot, size 11 or 12 at least. The prints circled my tent in a complete loop, then circled again, 2 full rotations around the place where I'd been sleeping. I followed them with the beam of my light, my breath coming in shallow gasps, tracing the path this person had walked while I lay unconscious just a few feet away. The prints did not approach the tent from the trail. They came from deeper in the forest, from a direction where there was no path, no reason for anyone to be walking. Whoever this was had not stumbled upon my camp by accident. They had come through the woods deliberately, found me in a spot that was not on any map, and circled my tent like a predator studying its prey. The boot prints stopped at the back of the tent. Not the entrance, not the vestibule, the back, directly behind where my head had been resting on my folded jacket. I stared at those prints, at the deep impression in the soil where someone had stood perfectly still, and I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. This person had walked twice around my tent, then positioned themselves inches from my skull, with only a thin layer of nylon between us. They had stood there listening to me breathe, maybe watching my silhouette through the fabric, close enough to touch me if they wanted. The realization hit me in waves, first disbelief, then horror, then a cold and primal fear that made every hair on my body stand rigid. I was 7 miles from the trailhead, no cell service, no other campers. Just me and whoever was out there in the dark. Someone patient enough to circle my tent twice and careful enough to test my zipper 1 millimeter at a time. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to run. Just grab the beacon,